And we are live with Beth Hawkins, nationally known education journalist in general, has been a long time journalist in the Twin Cities market, but has also covered wars, has covered Detroit, has had a national and local presence, has focused on education mostly, and probably has provided the most insightful education journalism that we have had here in the Twin Cities market for sure. And we sorely miss her presence now that she's a big cheese covering a national market. Beth, welcome. Good morning.
Good morning. Happy to be here. Thank you.
I am always excited when you're around, when you come on, because I feel smarter, and we have such a history going back. Beth and I have known each other for a while now, more than I think 11 years, 12 years, something like that. And in that time, you're my person I can bounce thoughts and ideas off of when it comes to education, and know that I'm going to get the rational, less emotional, not Chris Stewart-y type of way of looking at an issue. I wanted to talk to you about special education today. It's not something that I've talked much about in my morning broadcast. Don't usually feel qualified to fully understand the reform aspect of special education. I definitely understand it, I think, a little bit as the parent, the person who's worried about your kid getting everything they need. But when we talk about changing and improving systems, it seems easier to get the reform proposals in other areas than in special education. You had a tweet recently that made me want to have this conversation. So here's the tweet. 98% of my kids' class graduates Saturday from a school that's 98% free and reduced lunch. 100% of its special education students are graduating. And wait for it, 100% of our special ed kids were accepted to higher ed. And then you had hashtag educator belief for the win, FTW.
Yep. Can you see the graduation balloons here in the living room?
Yeah, I see those. So what's behind the tweet? Tell me what the story is.
So I have two kids. My son, my blonde-haired, blue-eyed son, got basically every advantage in the Minneapolis public schools starting in kindergarten. At the kindergarten roundup, I said to the teachers, I think he's gifted. And they said, okay. And they shoveled him into every advanced, higher level, rigorous track there was. He graduated with an IB diploma and a bilingual seal on that diploma. And there were no questions. I mean, there were some things about that experience that were subpar. It's excellent training to be a capitalist. Mm-hmm. He learned to, read people and get along with them in some ways that are maybe not as authentic as I would like. But the system never for once doubted him. And then my second child, my daughter, who has autism, came along, and she had some behaviors that were unusual or difficult or disruptive in the classroom. And by, I think, literally second grade, had been simultaneously identified as gifted for one of those selective entrance programs, and was being counseled right back out of it for not compliant. And what they said, the administrators, was, we don't do, they call it twice exceptional. We don't do twice exceptional. They were just bald-faced about it. And, if I could go back then, that's a civil rights suit in the making. But her trajectory has been very different. And, I'll tell you the statistics. Minneapolis Public Schools graduates 52% of its special ed kids.
52%?
52%.
Wow, that's very low.
That's actually higher than the national average. The national average is somewhere in the 40s.
I thought the national average, and I just looked up this morning. Okay, so keep going. Yeah, I thought it was higher than that.
So, there's a little bit of a wiggle in there, because some kids choose to stay in what they call transition services. Special education students are eligible for services until their 22nd birthday. And there are some kids who need independent living skills or vocational skills that stay on. But in general, your odds of graduating are terrible. And then your odds of graduating anywhere near college ready are worse. There are some states that will give you essentially a substitute diploma, a diploma that has lower requirements, so that you're a high school graduate, but you haven't necessarily completed an actual high school program.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And, you know, my child's experience from 3rd grade through, I think it was 7th when we finally pulled the plug on Minneapolis public schools, was pretty stereotypical. She got to attend her core classes unless and until her behavior or something about her behavior was upsetting or disruptive. And often it was her reaction to something in the environment, to the fluorescent lights or to pencils, you know, pencil scratch. Typically it was something sensory related. And in 7th grade, by 7th grade, we had just had it. We had a series of experiences. I rejected an IEP, which is an individualized education program. It's the federally mandated document that spells out the goals for your child, what should be done to meet those goals, and is revisited periodically. It's a super important document in special ed. It's created to backstop your child's rights, but it's not often a meaningful document. You know, Mandy's IEP in her very sought after Minneapolis schools, just basic. It was like in hindsight, I look at it like it's this magic thing, right? So it would say things like, you know, Mandy will complete her work 6 times out of 8 as observed by the teacher, but then there would be no how. It was like it was just supposed to magically happen. And her goals were written essentially to make her a different person, like she'll just become a compliant kid.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And there was never any how. And
what goes into writing that plan, though? I mean, how is that written?
So
do like the teachers write it and then they come back with you?
Yes, and then there's a conference, and there has to be a certain number of people at the conference. So there has to be a general ed teacher, there has to be somebody representing the administration. Every 3 years, there has to be a reevaluation to make sure that services are still appropriate and that you're assessing for all of the things that the child might need. But when we went in our traditional school, I mean, where I'm leading up to here is that she went through the second half of middle school and all of high school at a charter school that has a very high special ed enrollment and that doesn't have any of the sort of old traditional practices that Minneapolis public schools had. But so typically the special education teacher writes the IEP and then you sit down at a meeting and discuss it. And one of the things that makes special education so difficult is that teacher is both your child's best advocate, you know, the person who is supposed to get things for them and put out fires with general education teachers and, you know, basically be their champion in the school, is also the person the family has to push on. And, you know, just to put a cherry on the top of that, it's also the person who typically is responsible for educating you about your rights. So our special education case manager, teacher, when Mandy went into middle school, had tracked her into basically lower track classes. And we started pushing and objecting and showing her standardized test scores from the end of the year and arguing that, you know, if she's in the 98th percentile academically in all 3 subjects, she should have access to the higher level classes. And that, along with a couple of other things, just became Waterloo. And by 7th grade, I had objected. I had rejected an IEP. I had basically said, no, we're not doing this anymore. And the specific issue was pencils and math. That was it. That was the end for me. Was the system had decided that you have to show your work in pencil on paper. And that just drove her berserk because of the scratching.
Ooh, that drives me berserk.
It drives a lot of people berserk. I mean, we all have a little autism in there, and we learn about it. And I was like, I could go down the street with my credit card and buy an Apple Watch. Like, there is no reason in 2000, whatever it was, that this child has to use a pencil, except that you're so inflexible, she has to use a pencil. And it, you know, anyhow, I rejected an IEP, and the teacher burst into tears, and she said, not in 27 years of teaching have I had an IEP rejected. And there's a very strict body of federal law set up for what happens when you reject an IEP. So we had to have something called a conciliation conference. And the district compliance officer, so like the person tasked with essentially being the special ed ombudsman, came out and ran the compliance meetings. And after 6 or 7 of them, and keep in mind, like, I don't know how many tens of thousands of dollars of expensive professional time this was. He said to me, I need to leave you time to get a plan B for next year, because I can make her rewrite this IEP over and over and over again, but I can't change her attitude towards her child.
Ooh.
So that is a much, much more polite way of being counseled out of a school than I'm sure I would have experienced if I were a Black or brown or Indigenous mother. I mean, but we were for sure counseled out.
And this is, let's just be real with the record here, because I have a story I tell over and over again about my time with special ed parents in Minneapolis being a gateway to me understanding just about a lot about the system. But
yeah.
We're talking about a student with a mother who is college educated,
right,
and knows how to look up facts because you're a journalist.
Yep.
I can't think of a excuse me, a worse nightmare for the system than somebody who already studies the system and writes about the system and has a way or two of looking things up, right? And knowing, okay, so
and you want to actually, Chris, this will kill you. So our state education commissioner at the time, who we both know, who lives down the street from me.
Yeah.
I was on the phone with, and I was telling her the nutshell version of the story, and she didn't even draw a breath. She said, oh, this never would have happened if Jackie had still been there, because the school had just had a principal turnaround,
Mm-hmm.
had a new principal.
Mm-hmm.
There was no like, oh my God, I can't believe this happened to you. Oh, wow. I'm going to go make some calls and open a can of whoop ass. It was, this never would have happened if so-and-so hadn't been promoted to associate superintendent. That was her whole reaction.
Wow. Not, oh, this should never happen.
Right. Our state commissioner of education. Like, okay, I guess the writing is really on the wall. Like, I'm the most entitled parent in all of Minneapolis, and I can't get my kid the right to not use a pencil.
So here's the story I tell over and over and again about this. Anyone who has watched me over time and has heard me tell a special education story has heard this already, but for this conversation, it makes sense. And you've probably heard it before. But when I was meeting with parents as a school board member in Minneapolis, I took a meeting with the group that is kind of like a PTA for parents that have special education students in the district, and they would meet on a regular basis. So me and one other board member were really interested, took a meeting with them, sat down with them, and they started explaining all of what goes into being a special education parent in this district, in this particular district. And once they got kind of down the pipe a little bit, I said, this sounds like a full-time job. It sounds like, like you guys are documenting everything. You're having to bird dog on everything. You're having to come back again and again and again. And it was just hitting me that I was looking at all earnest, smart, educated parents who had to like make sacrifices in life to become a full-time kind of parent that bird dogs a public school district. And I said, so what happens with the parents that don't have all that going on? And one of the more kind of just straight up, honest, earnest ones, who was really kind of an activist, said to me, oh, those are the ones you guys send to jail. And I said, what do you mean send to jail? And she meant the students of those parents that don't have time to full-time bird dog the district and get what they need. We were putting them on these different tracks,
yep.
these non-special ed tracks.
Yep.
To one case, one person in the meeting was actually a doctor from the hospital, the local U of M hospital. It said to me, for those parents, oftentimes we are sick of your principals putting them in excuse me, ambulances and sending them to the emergency room when they're having a normal kid breakdown, because they don't want to handle with doing all the things they need to do at the school district. This is a doctor who came specifically to the meeting just to tell us stop putting special ed kids in ambulances. And of course, it was the poor, more of color kids that don't have parents that could bird dog the district full time. I only bring that up to say special education is full of equity issues, but it cuts across class and race and status and levels of perceived education and everything else. So getting back to your tweet though, it's time to rethink all of this.
Yep.
With the pandemic hitting, the first thing that we noticed was districts completely didn't know how to handle regular education. But when it came to special education, it was really just like, hands in the air. Sorry, guys. Like, we just don't know what to do for you.
I mean, can we just pause and say that having school districts across the country say we can't do distance learning because we can't ensure that it's equitable for the special education kids? I had no neutrality or objectivity about that. It's like, when did you ever try to ensure that anything was equitable for the special education kids? Or for that matter, for all these other populations of kids? You're going to insist upon serving them equitably now that it's a rationale for not doing this thing that you don't want to do because it's really hard and because you're not innovative and you can't turn on a dime.
It was a massive scapegoating.
Total massive scapegoating, scapegoating. And I'll tell you what, our small charter school, so that graduating class had 48 kids. It's the founding class. So our first class of graduates, I mean, they pivoted to distance learning, not perfectly, but very quickly. And there were some problems. And there's one large thing that I think needs to be addressed before special ed kids are served next year. But we had a distance IEP meeting. In fact, we had a distance IEP meeting on Zoom that wrote an IEP that is intended to serve as a guide for what college will do to provide disability services. So like a, power charged IEP, we had a couple of experts in the room who said, college is covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is different and not nearly as powerful as the law that governs K-12 education, which is the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. So, here's something that's a right under idea. Here's how we're going to write this document. So when the accessibility services at the college reads it, they'll be able to translate that into a college level accommodation. So we managed to do that. She had terrific paraprofessional support throughout the spring because, we weren't in a district and we weren't trying to figure out how to communicate via a bureaucracy. I mean, her paraprofessionals just texted her. And they figured out that in pandemic learning, kids are sleeping late. 10 to 4 are the best hours to get their attention. And
we should say this is a charter school.
This is a charter school. This is a small 350 student charter school, middle and high school. She had individual meetings with teachers when she needed it. Mostly she didn't need it. Mostly she got school done in 30 minutes a day, which is part of, that's an interesting thing to bring up because in her case, because we're talking about autism, which I have come over the years to firmly believe is a type of intelligence that and needs to be embraced as such. The academic part of school is hardly challenging. It's the process of navigating the physical environment, the social environment, the kind of constricts of school that made it so hellacious. So I don't believe that we can't do special ed in distance learning. I think it's like anything, what we're seeing with distance learning everywhere, that schools are playing to their strengths. Places that had strong relationships continue to have strong relationships. Places that had strong academics. I don't know if you saw the piece from the Center on Reinventing Public Education about the fellow that they had who attended class at Success Academy online.
No.
Okay, it's really worth looking up. One of their scholars spent a day in Success Academy classes and watched how they did online learning. And so the teacher was teaching a very large number of students, and the other teachers So like, let's say 5 fifth grade teachers. So one of them is teaching and the other 4 are almost Google Docs style interacting with individual students, kind of doing the virtual equivalent of all the checks for understanding and, sticking in a note saying, give this another try. I think you can sharpen this. Anyhow, all to say, I think that it's perfectly possible to do special ed in a virtual environment. It's probably not possible to do certain kinds of assessments, and getting some services to students remotely, I think, is difficult. But
I mean, in one way, what you said though earlier is if it's hard to give special education its due in normal times, in times that aren't pandemic, COVID, distance learning time, the idea that you expect school districts to shift to achieve a level of competence that they don't have during good times,
yep,
is probably not reasonable, because they can't do anything well, it seems like, in regular times. So then when you put them under stress of having to do something new and different quickly, you're in a charter school, you're a board member of a charter school that could be nimble and agile and already had virtual infrastructure for virtual learning in place. So the need to shift quickly could happen faster than it could for a district. But your main point that you have made that I think is really important here is, if everything is going to be upset now anyways, why not rethink what you do with the 7 million kids that you have in special education, 7.1 million kids that are covered under IDEA in the United States? If you have to rethink everything anyways, why not start from the premise of, we have to fix everything anyways? Like, we have to do something different anyways. We wouldn't have had to do this before. If they were to take that seriously, what do you think is the story that isn't being told, that hasn't been written yet, about special education and the possibilities, what the science says, what could be done?
Well, your commenter here on the screen, Toya, how would we expect schools to get special education right if we can't get non-special ed right? I mean, I think that goes to the core of it. Minneapolis, a few years back, I think that you had cycled off the board at this point, audited special ed, and the auditors came back and said, well, your special ed kids can't read because your kids can't read. You need to address kindergarten through 3rd grade reading in a serious and intentional way, which of course never happened. But if you do that, the percentage of kids who can read, and thus the percentage of special ed kids who can read, will skyrocket. And the irony of that is that the intervention that would have ratcheted up those literacy rates is one that was developed for students with dyslexia. I mean, it would have been a Orton Gillingham type literacy curriculum. But in answer to your question, and this is just me spitballing, right? Like trying to cram all my hats on the same head. I've written a series of stories in recent weeks about what some of the assessment people think about reopening, like not hand sanitizer and distancing and all of that, but like, how are we going to measure, identify, and solve for learning losses from this year, next fall? And the two big things, the two big stories that I've written that involve NWEA research, suggest that COVID slide, which is summer slide and school closure research extrapolated out to the number of months that we've gotten, COVID slide may be a couple of years for some kids. It's going to be super exacerbated for some. It's probably kids are going to come back with 70% of their reading, and I think it's like 50% of their math. And the difference there is that you keep reading in the summer. Some kids keep reading in the summer, but math is very tied to classroom instruction. So that's the slide. And then the second piece, separate piece of research, but also under NWEA's. NWEA is the nonprofit assessment outfit that makes the measures of academic progress, or MAP, which is the diagnostic test that a lot of schools administer 2 or 3 times a year to kind of check for individual skill understanding. It's a growth measure test. It was I think the first of the adaptive ones. So it just kind of starts, it gets harder as you answer questions right. So it can dip below grade level and above grade level and measure where kids are on individual concepts and skills.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a super valuable data set. And yep, there it is. You got it pulled up. So they've used it with some other data sets to predict slide, but they've also used it to say, okay, class variability within classrooms. They looked at 5th grade classrooms in the 10 highest used states and said the average classroom has 5 grade levels in reading, kids represented in 5 grade levels, and in math 7. So the slide is likely to just widen that range. So a teacher next fall may be looking at teaching 7 or more grade levels in a single class.
Wow.
And what their folks have said we should be making of these two numbers is that you need to assess, like on day 1, all of your kids, and you need to begin thinking not so much by age groupings as by missing concepts and skills. And you need to come up with an individual roadmap for each child. Like, where is this kid in relation to the grade that they're supposed to be starting? What specific skills need remediation if they're going to continue with grade level material? Which is essentially what the spirit of the law said we were supposed to be doing for special ed kids, which was to come up with a unique and perfectly tailored program to, in my child's case, not decrease the rigor at all, but get rid of the pencils, or make another accommodation that allows that child to access that material. So if the plan now ought to be, we do that for every kid, that's great. I mean, the special ed kids could soar under such a system.
I mean, in that way, though, you're really expecting to make the big fix for everybody so that it has an ancillary benefit for special education students. I mean, is that a fair way to put it? It's almost like trickle-down equity.
Yeah. So we just finally, in the last 2 weeks, at the 74 million where I work, have started running stories that we reported and wrote in the few weeks before the pandemic that, nobody was going to read. Mm-hmm. And that was the major news. And I had just come back from Los Angeles, where I'd visited 3 schools that were positive special education outliers. And all 3 of them practice different versions of something called full inclusion, which basically says no child gets sent out of the classroom ever.
Mainstreamed completely.
So my kid went through all of elementary and middle school without ever, say, having an art class or a music class or any of those things that make school fun and engaging, because that was when she got her special ed minutes. So it was just like wall-to-wall drudgery for her. But at these schools in California, if there's a service, it's brought in and incorporated into the entire class. So if one child needs 30 minutes twice a week of occupational therapy, it's just woven into the lesson 2 days a week. And what they have discovered is, like, it's good for all kids. Like, if you have to drill down on a particular component of literacy to reach 2 or 3 kids who are dyslexic, everybody else just gets farther ahead.
That gets a little bit controversial. I want you to take a look at this graph, because I'm not sure I'm reading this the right way. I saw this earlier when I was preparing for our talk today.
Yeah.
And it says, it basically looks like since the year 2000 and, until now, the percentage of students, the percentage of IDEA covered students who spent time inside the classroom, the general classrooms, has gone up like a lot. And the number that have since 2000 that have spent time outside of the regular classroom has dropped like a ton. So in 20 years, there's been this trend of mainstreaming special education students that I didn't know about. Like, I knew we were trying it in spots and places. I didn't know it was a national trend. So this theoretically should tell us that these kids have been getting better and better education over time. No.
So the law says that a child with a disability has an absolute right to an education in the least restrictive environment, which is intended to make it difficult to push them into segregated settings. Which, of course, they are. I mean, we push Black and brown boys into segregated classrooms full of children we perceive to be defiant. If that's, the midway stop on the school to prison pipeline. So we have mainstreamed more kids. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting access to an education that's accessible to them. So as the number of special education students in charter schools has reached parity with the number of special education students in district schools, which has happened in the last few years, one of the things that we're seeing that's still not clearly understood is that those students they're much more likely to be mainstreamed in a charter school. So the next question on researchers' plates is that because those schools are more flexible in accommodating an array of learning needs in a single classroom, or is it because they're simply not being offered appropriate services because the school may not have the expertise, may be getting away with short shrifting those kids, may have simply decided, that the IEP is a piece of paper that lives in a drawer. So I think how well a child is served in a mainstream setting is very much an open question. I've visited some schools where there's co-teaching, where the content or grade level specialist has a special education teacher and they work side by side. Brooklyn Prospect, for example, in Brooklyn in New York City, you can't tell which teacher is which. And they've just taken the number of special education teachers that they're funded for and put one in every classroom. To the result that all of their kids benefit because they have two teachers. And indeed, the nexus between special ed and behavior is a gritty place. But if you have two teachers and a kid who's had a bad night and morning, you have somebody who can, with a great deal of discretion and time and privacy, help that kid iron out their rough morning. So there are all kinds of ways to deal with this, but you can also just sit a kid in a chair at the fringe of the classroom and not.
I mean, under the idea that equity is about every kid getting what they need. Equality is about making sure that every student has an equal access to what they need. We talk about what you just said in terms of what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and meaning like if you teach everybody to read, of course you will be teaching, you will be doing better teaching for special education students. But I want to stick on this mainstreaming thing for a while because there's been research around, the least restrictive environment being for the good of the student and the entire, community and population. Yet when school districts try to do it, and a weird thing happens with educators who profess to be about equity all the time, show up to say that it's a cynical plot to destroy public education. So, I want to be very clear about, let me give an example so that I'm not just talking and people think, oh my God, here he goes again, beating up on teachers, because this is an example that blew my mind and continues to blow my because it happens in multiple places. In Oakland, a few years ago, Oakland School District proposes greater mainstreaming of special education students. Antoine Wilson, who was the superintendent at the time, proposed that the district mainstream more kids and get them out of special education ghettos and get them into regular classrooms so that they could receive the full benefit of an integrated education. Sounds like not that big of a deal. Sounds smart. Sounds equity minded. Sounds like something you would do if you actually cared. And oh my God, here comes the union and middle class, white, middle-aged educators who just live in a culture of grievance and want to make sure that nothing ever happens that they don't like. So Mark Aragood is one of the Oakland, he's a special education teacher in Oakland, also happens to be one of the union leadership, jumps out on everything crazy like Oakland's teacher union does, and says really weird, bizarre shit all the time. But in this case, he's saying that the push towards an all-inclusive classroom is really kind of like this covert push to downgrade special education. He's saying this as a special education teacher, and it's an attempt to make the district go backwards. It's a cynical sentiment, and what you're really doing is taking away real services and blah blah blah. Behind that statement, what most people don't want to talk about is the fact that his statement is not real, in that it really is about doing something cynical. It's the real cynical part is it's teachers like him and their unions that don't want these kids in mainstreamed regular classrooms. And the way that they fight back against it happening is trying to put an equity spin on it that's just bizarre. It's absurd. The federal law is telling you that you should have the least restrictive environment possible, and districts haven't been doing that. So when you go to correct it, to have teachers show up with their unions and push back on it. I'm bringing this up not as a point of what happened in Oakland. This happened in Minneapolis too. This happened in St. Paul, as a matter of fact.
Over and over again.
Same thing happens, time and time again. And it's the same earnest, lovely little people who just want to push equity all the time, who show up to say the most inequitable nonsense when you try to mainstream and improve services for special education. I asked you earlier what you think is kind of like the story that hasn't been written yet. I wonder if some of the weird resistance to doing the best for special education students is akin to the teachers who don't want to teach reading in a science-based way, being the story around, that broke with reading, for instance. Yeah. I'm looking for what's the story that's going to break, that's going to get the public understanding in the same way that the reading story that now is so popular did. What will be that story for special ed? I'm locating it in the systemic, I don't know what you call it. If it's, resistance to doing the right thing. What would you say could be that story? So,
part of the resistance that you cite has to do with this concept of minutes, and this concept that a general education teacher has someplace to send a student. So if they have a student who has problematic behaviors, whether that student has a disability or not, they need someplace to send them, right? In your room, the principal's office, wherever that is. The special ed version of that is the resource room, or the cottage, the bungalow. I mean, districts have these crazy names for these places to try to make them sound pleasant.
The justice room was my favorite one.
There you go.
Justice room.
So there's a whole adult ecosystem that depends on there being places to send kids. And somebody needs to staff that place and to basically be like the expert. So in a sense, like, you really are talking about disturbing the status quo. But it's also true. I mean, so what? Special ed kids are 14%. Kids with disabilities are 14% of the nation's kids. If you put in children who have 504 plans, which is a less rigorous document, IEP, you might have it if you have ADD.
We have one. I'll tell you, it's a diet IEP.
Yeah, exactly. That's perfect. So if you
Diet Coke of IEPs.
If you throw in the kids on 504 plans, it's 1/5 of students in the United States have some form of disability accommodation. So, I mean, I would argue the place I've come to is you also have that percentage or more of students learning English. And we have now IPOC numbers of children who are homeless or highly mobile. We have students who are persisting with intergenerational trauma. I mean, a classroom teacher now needs to come equipped to see and have some understanding of that range of challenges or that range of unaddressed needs. And I think that there are some teacher prep programs. I wrote about, I use Steinhardt School of Education. now has a teacher residency program where everybody who goes through it is trained in special ed and English language learner strategies. Because if you have a classroom of 25 or 30 kids, you know, 40% of them are going to have some sort of need that's outside typical general ed training.
I mean, that feels like it's going way upstream, though. I mean, if we're preparing teachers to be kind of more ambidextrous, for lack of a better word, you know, like the ability to teach a broader set of students, that's a good thing.
Yep.
If we're arming them with the tools that we know don't exist right now in the teaching pool that are modern, you know, when it comes to teaching special education students, that's a good thing. But if the system itself is resistant to changing what you just described, a system where you need to send kids somewhere when they don't fit your profile of what you want in your classroom, and that could be for many reasons, special ed being one of them. Also, what you just said too about someone needs to staff those special rooms.
Yep.
So you're talking about jobs and pensions. And, you know, it's like when prison guards show up to fight any legislation that decriminalizes anything.
Right.
So you want to decriminalize drugs in any state, it's the prison guards union and the police officers unions that show up to fight it. And they want to fight it because they want a steady stream of prisoners. They want people to rest. And so in the special ed equivalent are people, if you're talking about shutting down special education ghettos in school districts, you have to realize that somebody staffs those ghettos.
Yeah, so interesting. We, as Chris said, have had a number of these blow-ups in Minneapolis and St. Paul in recent years as both districts tried to reform both racially disparate discipline and, you know, just plain bad special education. And in one of them, the district attempted to move to a system where they would have special education teachers helping general education instructors with their mainstream kids with autism. And my child was still in the district at this point. And what happened was that the teacher corps, the special education teacher corps, which was older, and I mean, our teacher corps here is 96% white, but, you know, these were older, even more white women at the top of the union seniority list for the most part, started telling the parents on their caseloads that this was an attempt to defund special ed and begin denying their children services. And some of the stories that parents came away with were just bonkers. Like, you know, we had parents on Facebook threatening and marching on the school board and throwing, I mean, they had T-shirts and yard signs and all the craziness because the thing was, you know, your child is going to be allowed to run out in traffic. There's going to be nobody protecting your child from, you know, the impulsive behavior that comes with their disability, or they're going to be allowed to hurt themselves.
And this is a problem that gets on my nerves because that connection between white, middle-class, college-educated teacher in the classroom who can use social capital with white, middle-class, college-educated parents of their students to put pressure on the district to do things that impact everyone. Like, you know, is a social justice problem to me. It's a social justice governance problem because that shouldn't be allowed to happen. Like, we have a Karen problem in education. We have a serious Karen problem in education. So for your handful of teachers who get together with the union and decide we don't want to mainstream, you know, special education students, we don't want to lose our staffed inequitable justice rooms where we warehouse everybody in special education ghettos. So this is what we'll do. We'll go to all the Karens on our caseload and we'll tell the Karens to go after the district and the newspapers and everybody else to say what this actually is a cynical plot to defund education, right? You know, and basically what they're saying is defund privilege. Let's just be real. When we say defund education, they're saying they want to defund our privilege. But anyways, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, the Karens is exactly right. When we were being counseled out, we were told, you know, oh, you're lucky. You're lucky that your child has an IEP. And if you don't sign this IEP, you know, this was in the middle of the whole process where the the conciliation officer the compliance officer was working with us. The teacher said, if you don't sign this, your child could lose services. I mean, you're lucky right now to get full special ed. And, if we go to this model, I don't know, she might not have anything next year. Mm-hmm. The other Karen thing that happens all the time is, ooh, if this was my child, I don't, then there's some questioning of your parental judgment. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And after 2 or 3 meetings, the social worker comes to your house. This was just a great day in my life. The social worker comes to your house and asks who sleeps there. Comes in, looks around, sits down, starts asking questions about your life.
Oh, hell no. Wait a second. What? So you've had a couple meetings with district staff, with school, and then a social worker comes to your house for what purpose?
Well, just to complete the record, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So sits down, wants to, talk about your life and your background, and starts asking questions about your kid's other parent and who lives here and what happened and what was the trajectory of all that. And it's very invasive and intrusive and shaming.
Wow.
Very, very shaming. They want to, look around the house. All under the guise of getting to know you so that the system can support your child. But to me, it felt very much like we're just going to continue to ratchet up this notion that you're a messy person sending us a messy kid. And the kid is messy. The kid is showing up messy because you're messy.
So wait a second, because this is driving me absolutely bonkers here right now. I don't know how I don't know how that person would not leave with their feelings hurt if I ever encountered that meeting. So you are sitting with a professional person that is supposed to be some sort of a guardian of help to you, who's a social worker. They're in your house.
Yeah.
Well, which to me starts a real problem. They're in your house and they're asking you questions about your family structure and your setup under the guise of it will help them do better to educate your student.
Yeah. Yeah. And the difference between you and me, Chris, is like, I grew up entitled. I mean, this for me was a new experience. I had no, my parents did not train me to see when my rights were being violated. When I was a child, there was very little reason to train a white child in a upper middle class household to, recognize those moments and respond to them.
To be anything other than compliant because the system was basically
right.
good. Yeah.
Right. So my inherent Karenism, I was not prepared to stand up to Karen.
Well, and career Karenism is endemic in special education, but these type of point of sale in interactions, transactions, engagements, if you were to look at them in total, many of them, how many they are, it's what creates the thing we call inequity. When we talk about systemic inequity, we don't talk about the physics of it, the mechanics of it, where it happens. And I am literally thinking of a parent like you who is working on a plan with the district, is being involved and collaborative in the way that you're supposed to be, who is trying to be a partner to the system to get the best for a student. Everything that we're told we're supposed to do. Everything we're told that we're supposed to be, educate yourself on the process, be involved, be responsive, show up when you're supposed to show up, be a partner, listen to what they have to tell you, all that stuff. You've done that. And you at the same time have said, I'm a reasonably intelligent person. I've figured out for myself what is best for my child. So it really is a partnership. It's not you sitting me down, telling me what's good for me because I pay you, right? Like, so we're going to have an exchange here. You're not going to be my boss and I'm not necessarily going to be your boss, but I have a kid, you don't. So kind of changes the dynamic here. That's all well and good though. But then you get a social worker sitting in your house asking about your family structure and things that you said yourself sound invasive and intrusive. And I don't know how a person who isn't you isn't going to freak out at that point, and we're going to have a real breakdown of the home-school relationship.
Right. So Minneapolis is in the process of redrawing its attendance boundaries. of its schools, and they just did exit surveys for the first time since, I think, your board service. There was an exit survey for a year or two, but they just did kind of a pilot sample. And the number one reason that families were leaving the district is that they felt disrespected, and they felt that their interactions with teachers and administrators were disrespectful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, not academics, which is it's on the list of things that people cite when they leave. Not safety, which is way up on the list of things people cite when they leave, but disrespectful interactions.
Mm-hmm. With the district staff, period, I'd imagine. Yeah. And if you're a special education student, I would imagine that's only amplified. And in the Twin Cities, I mean, like, listen, I'll never stop pointing this out because it's just fun to, but our number one expert on public school integration in the Twin Cities is a person who took his own kids out of the district schools and put them in one of the whitest special education schools that's worth every penny, apparently, I'm told, ever. So when you're talking about exit interviews, the most liberal white parents or whatnot, if they face a problem that they don't want to continue having with the public schools, have a place to go. They really do. They can get them out of the Minneapolis public schools into a suburban school that has a small enclave program that they've heard great things about and they want to try, and that they have the transportation to take their kid to. They have a couple of private schools that specialize in providing the Disney service to special education students. And if you can afford the cost, you can go there. Everybody else has to keep fighting it out with a district that doesn't seem to be motivated to doing the right thing, period, but definitely around special education students. Do you think, so we're talking very locally now, and you also focus nationally again, and I know I'm beating a dead horse. I keep coming back to this idea of what's the expose. You know, like in the 70s, didn't Geraldo Rivera cut his teeth on a story about exposing how people were being treated in, was it the
psychiatric facilities?
Psychiatric facilities, yeah. And that's what gave us Geraldo.
Yeah, Geraldo and I graduated from the same journalism school. I don't know.
Lord have mercy. Is that true?
It is true. It is.
Oh, wow.
And Kitty Kelly. Kitty Kelly also is a
really
of my journalism school. Yeah, I know. I just destroyed my credibility with all
You will never destroy your credibility. But
I do think that if you solve for the special education kids, you've solved for pretty much everybody. I mean, the things that you need to do to make culture and instruction accessible to all kids, to make it universally accessible, is just plain old good for kids. And I think that, you know, the thing that has happened for me in the last couple of years is I've gotten to spend time in schools that have just thrown out the model, the, you know, sage on a stage model, and are doing something radically different, is that in order to make that shift, to like really, truly make that shift, you have to shift your beliefs. And you have to do it in a way that's analogous to the way we're doing it for other kids who have been perceived as like walking deficits generations. I mean, you have to perceive children with intellectual and neuropsychological disabilities as intelligent and capable and ambitious and as possessing gifts that we desperately need. In Washington State, this blew my mind. Washington State has a group, a task force with Microsoft, Amazon, Boeing, and one other major employer there that is looking at how to make workplaces autism friendly. Because they desperately need autistic employees, because they think out of the box, they don't make mistakes, and they don't quit.
Wow.
You can keep them. So their question is, how do we pull these kids up through a system that doesn't understand how badly we want their intelligence?
Well, this makes me want to push, though, on something you've said multiple times, like what's good for these kids are good for all kids. There's kind of like the Kirwan Institute. John Powell has this thing around a targeted universalism, meaning like you do something that's universal, but you target it in ways in which it helps certain populations that need the help, right? A lot. So one good example is when you look at the corners of crosswalks. When you go through a crosswalk and you see that little dip down thing that allows wheelchairs to go up a curve easier on the end, is something that is good for people with disabilities. But as it turns out, for people that don't have disabilities who are pulling like luggage or pushing a stroller or some other reason, it's good for everybody to have that little divot cut out at the end of a corner, right? On a crosswalk. So it's an example of something that was meant for people that have a disability of sorts or an ability difference of sorts, but it actually ends up being good for everybody because I get to use it for a different purpose, and it helps me. But what if that divot at the end of the corner wasn't really just good for me? It really was just good for the person that needs it for a very specific reason. And I can't sell it as a thing that's good for everybody. I can't all lives matter it, right? Like really in this case, there are specific ways of teaching kids in special education better, that it really doesn't become about it being good for everybody else. It really is about teaching this group of kids in a way that they need. Are we missing the boat on those things if we all lives matter it?
I think that there are children with disabilities that need very specific and narrow tailored interventions.
Mm-hmm. Like kids with dyslexia, maybe, for instance.
Well, I was going to go to dyslexia as the broader example. I'm thinking of children who are medically fragile, who have a developmental disability, and who, I was in a school in California during that reporting trip where they had made social stories about the books, or a child who is nonverbal and needs a communication device. I mean, yes, those interventions are probably not going to be generalizable or whatever I'm forgetting the exact phrase that Powell used. But
targeted universalism.
Targeted universalism. But if you look at dyslexic kids, I mean, that's a great place to go, because you also have this core of white parents of dyslexic kids whose kids can't read. And by like second or third grade, they've been told to go get this outside intervention so that their kid can read. And what we now know from the last 18 months or 2 years with all of the news media focus on literacy is that intervention that people have gone outside the system to acquire with their middle-class money is what we need to be doing to do evidence and science-based literacy for everybody. So let's take Orton Gillingham, which is, the Mac Daddy of the dyslexia literacy programs. If you give my child who's not dyslexic Orton Gillingham, you're not going to hurt them. If anything, you're going to rocket them ahead.
Really?
No reason. Yeah. Not, it's not everything. You also need content knowledge. You need like the full menu of literacy services, but it's not like somebody's going to be harmed by using a curriculum that was developed for dyslexia.
Yeah. And I don't know enough about it to say. It just seems to me that sometimes what your child needs isn't good for everybody else, but by science, it has been proven to help whatever particular situation you have going on. Like I think in some ways, if you're 3 grade levels behind, if you have an entire group of kids that are 3 grade levels behind, it might be a little different than ones where you have whole classrooms of kids that are a year ahead, for instance.
Yeah, and to circle back to the start of the conversation, that is exactly the moment we're about to enter. We are about to enter a moment where, because of the pandemic, and because kids have had such uneven experiences during the pandemic, whenever school reopens and however it reopens, you're going to have some kids who are 3 years behind, and some kids who, spent the summer in their parents' library and are 2 years ahead. And you are going to have to tailor remediation to kids at that variety of levels.
Now, I know you've written about this, so we're thinking ahead. We don't, none of us know exactly when the schools will reopen in earnest, like when it will be back to normal, so-called back to normal, or if it will ever be back to normal. But let's just say to some extent they start opening. And What is it that you want to see them do with special education that's different, that shows kind of like they've grown and we're taking a leap forward rather than doing business as usual? What's the thing that districts and schools and everybody could be doing to show to show that they've exploited the opportunity to do better quickly?
If we're going back in some sort of blended model, right? Whether that's A day, B day, so that there's room in schools for social distancing, whether it's partial days or some kids go back early, some kids continue with distance learning. I mean, we could really revision our concept of time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You know, you could have your A-day class with your math teacher for 60 minutes or 45 minutes or whatever seems doable. And then the rest of that time could be repurposed. Mm-hmm. You could spend it with individual or small group, not remediation, reinforcement, I think is what I'm thinking. I mean, when my child got services during distance learning, she didn't attend a synchronous or asynchronous class. She worked either on the phone or on Zoom or by text with a teacher or a paraprofessional on a very specific task. So, you know, if we're letting go of, you know, kicking and screaming perhaps in a lot of places, but if we're letting go of the idea of, you know, 6 consecutive hours in a building with your body adjacent to all these other bodies, mm-hmm. How are we going to make up that time?
If you do that, though, you have to consider virtual options and infrastructure and a change in the way that you staff to make that a reality. Yeah.
The one thing that did not go well for my child during her last term of school was advanced placement computer science.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And
wow, that's weird. Really? Virtually, that didn't work?
Well, 2 reasons. One, the College Board, which I think we're all hearing like it's damaged as, you know, colleges start to go test optional and they were unable to administer all kinds of tests this spring, is just somebody needs to take this on, maybe me, super not set up to accommodate kids in special ed. I mean, I think it's just like, it's not in their DNA that children with disabilities are going to be taking advanced placement tests. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that happened is that there are almost no special educators with math, science, engineering, and technology credentials. Mm. So my kid was caught in this interesting place where there were no appropriate accommodations being offered by the College Board, and there was no person on staff who both understood special education and had the chops to actually modify for that. So we just bagged the AP credit. We just said, you know, you just take it as a high school class pass fail, but we're privileged. I mean, we can do that and it doesn't cost us anything. So I think what needs to happen is if you're moving away from that traditional day, you need to also think about getting children in front of the right kind of expertise. I mean, at a traditional school, often special education paraprofessionals, I mean, I think that the qualification in Minneapolis is 2 years of credits from higher ed. You don't have to have gotten the associate's degree, but and people are paid $20 an hour. I mean, your child is not always spending their day with somebody who is equipped to teach them. They're spending their day with somebody who is equipped to monitor and manage their behavior.
Well, cynical Chris Stewart will say that is the real pandemic of education, is the pandemic of educational malpractice, misstaffing, inappropriate preparation of people who will become what we call educators, who literally, if educating means people come out the other end more educated, we have to call into question the thing we call educators and the thing that we call education. We are coming up on time here. We're going over a little bit. It's always a joy to talk to you, Beth. As we've been talking, your Twitter handle has been going across the bottom. So for people that are listening or watching, it's at Beth_Hawkins. You can find Beth on Twitter. Beth also is a journalist and writes for The 74 National Education publication, where she has had a string of stories recently that you should go back and check out that do a much better job than this conversation of laying some groundwork for understanding what could happen in the future with special education. I want to go back to the thing that started all of this. I care about the belief gap. I care about the gap in belief between what our kids are capable of and what adults in their lives think that they're capable of. The difference between those two things is what I call the belief gap. And I think if we close that before everything else, we will be ahead of the curve. And a tweet like Beth's that caused me to want to have a conversation like this in the first place that says 90% of my kids' class graduates Saturday from a school that is 98% free and reduced lunch. 100% of its special education students are graduating, and 100% of our special education students were accepted to higher ed. I can't think of a more powerful belief gap measure, closing measure, than a story like that. It's a story that we want to see nationally, but as we've talked about today, it's not magic that can make that happen. There's no easy road to it. There's no silver bullet. There's no smart way to just say, like, here's a proposal. We're going to make it happen tomorrow. But what there is a serious need to confront the system for what it is doing that blocks us from getting to that being the story for every kid in America. So, Beth, thank you, as always, for helping us close the belief gap. Hope you'll come back again.
Oh, it was so fun. Thank you.
To my listeners, to the people who have who've been leaving comments throughout this, please leave any resources in the comments that you think are important for us to watch and read and share with others. Appreciate you for watching every morning too. And we see like Gail Jefferson and Toya and Lucy Arias and Michelle Johnson, Dr. Michelle Johnson, and Debbie Meyer, who's a stalwart. Anytime that we talk about special education, Debbie Meyer has a lot to offer and show us. Christina Laster. All of you guys make this morning and mornings like this just amazing for me because we learn so much, and I do read every comment after the show. So thank you all for watching, and we will see you tomorrow.